Greetings and welcome to today's video. Subscribers are probably aware of the fact that I scratch build amps and I use the chassis designs from really classic vintage amplifiers like some of the early 50s and 60s Fender circuit designs, and then build them in my own cabinets with special speakers and try to come up with a nice combo amp that has the great tone of the vintage amplifiers, but with well, it's actually affordable because I build them myself. I can do this at a fraction of what it would cost to buy one of these. Let's take a look at this one. This is a Fender AA864 chassis design for the Fender Bassman from probably the early to mid 60s. Just a classic guitar amp, usually found in a large, either a head with a big bass speaker cabinet, or as a giant combo amp with like 4 10s. Way too big for a normal person to lug around. So I made a compact version of the Bassman that I can more or less carry around. It's still fairly heavy, but it really is very compact and it has some really good sound characteristics. Let's take a look at some of the details of this amp. First stop is the control panel, where I have a high gain and low gain input, a bright switch, which proved to not be all that useful, or necessary, I should say, volume. We have treble and bass tone, separate, standby switch, pilot light, and power on and off. I named this I use my amp name, my building name of Danasonic, and I call it the Mighty Mouse because those of us of a particular age can remember a cartoon where a rather compact little mouse was very powerful. And it just came to mind with this because this is such a small cabinet but capable of such ungodly volume and power that I just thought it was appropriate. The grill cloth I've mentioned in another video. It's actually the material used to reupholster chaise lounges and deck chairs, available probably at your local fabric store for about $10 a yard, as opposed to buying other types of grill cloth that you have to pay like $30 and $40 a yard for. And I think it looks really neat, and it is strong as heck. I mean, you could, like I said before, you could stand on this, you could tow a bus with it. It's really stout stuff, inexpensive and attractive. So what's the downside? If you notice, I covered this with a tweed. Now this is not the cloth tweed like that Fenders used to use. The downside of using tweed in one of these is that when you're through upholstering it, then you have to coat it with many coats of a yellow tinted lacquer. That's pretty tedious, and if you make any mistakes, it's really hard to undo it. So I use, it's sort of a vinyl tweed material that I got from Antique Electronic Supply in Tempe, Arizona. I recommend it. It's not the easiest stuff in the world to deal with because it's fairly stiff. It doesn't stretch, so you have to be real careful in your corners and seams, that you really have to be careful with them to make them come out right. The alignment of the tweed. Tweed is a real pain. I wouldn't recommend it for your first upholstery job because you've got to try to line up all the lines, and these lines come at you from all different directions. It's really a challenge. It's real tough to do, but I think this came out pretty well. Okay, so that's the front of the cabinet. The sides are more the same, the tweed. The rear is just utter simplicity. I made a matching rear back door. Got my little access port down here where you can reach in and get your cord and pull it out. And then up above I have my cooling vent here for the tubes. I've got the 2 amp slow blow fuse on the left, and I've got a 4 ohm and an 8 ohm speaker jack on the back here so that you can connect to either the cabinet speaker with this Fender-like jack, or I can unplug this and plug in any other speaker or speaker cabinet that I want. Okay, I tried to label them so I wouldn't get confused. All in all, pretty decent, fairly simple back end. Now let's pull the back door and take a look inside. Okay, here's the back view with the back door removed. First little surprise is the speaker. Original Fender Bassman usually had 4 10s, and say they were good husky Jensen's at 50 watts each. That would give them a total of 200 watts power handling capability. Since that's, I wanted to have a compact cabinet with really ferocious volume and power potential, I went with this. It's a 400 watt speaker, so I just don't see the chassis overpowering it. Okay, it's been just a spectacular speaker. The bass response is unbelievable. Up in the attic, we've got the chassis and we've got the power transformer, of course, filter choke, output transformer, two 12AX7s, 12AT7, and two 6L6s. I imagine that the total power output, because the 6L6s are in fixed bias, would be pretty close to 50 watts. Which is quite a bit. Compared to the little single-ended amps that I'm used to building that are 8 watt and 10 watt amps, this thing is quite the beast. I wasn't prepared for not being able to turn the volume up past like 1.5 or so without incurring the wife's wrath. But it did everything I wanted. It reminds me of an old 65 GTO I had years ago, kind of a small, compact exterior with a very, very stout engine. And that's the way I look at this. I think you could lug this into place a jam night or something like that, plug it in, and as everybody's snickering, turn it up to about 5 and blow them out the windows and doors. It's a very, very stout amp. I'm going to now open up the chassis. We'll take a look at the construction details. Stay tuned. One of the advantages of designing your own amplifier from scratch is that you can try to avoid some of the pitfalls that commercial amplifiers seem to all have. And number one on my list is access to the chassis. I don't think they want you to work on the chassis, so they make it as hard as they can to get at. I mean, you know, sometimes you have to pull speakers, baffles, all sorts of other screws, bolts, supports, and everything to get the chassis out. In my case, I made it simple. A screw on either side and just pull it out. It's just a big aluminum drawer. Okay, and it gives you access to about everything you need to work on one of these amplifiers. Down here we have our 6L6s. They're in fixed bias. Here is the bias adjustment knob. All you have to do is put your ammeter on across your output transformer and tune this to the settings that would be appropriate for your milliamps for your tubes. You see the little marks I have there to help me find the bias that I thought was appropriate. Got the 12AT7 phase inverter. We've got the second 12AX7. Here is the first 12AX7. It's under this shield, and the reason that it's under there is that due to limitation in space and the way I wanted the layout to be, I put the first tube, I think, probably too close to the power supply. That's a Bush League error. It was sort of unavoidable in this design. To compensate, I built this shield. It cuts down. There is still a little bit of a hum that I believe is induced by power supply being too close to the first tube, but this really cut it down. Okay, in the future, I would probably try to avoid that problem, but that's the way it is. Okay, and I learned to live with it. If you look, another concession to limited space is underneath there is the power transformer, and I built like a little loft or a second story here for all of the filter capacitors, all of their resistors, and the diodes that do the rectification. Okay, if you notice, the filament wires are all tightly twisted to cut down on hum. I've shielded, all of the signal cables are shielded. Let's look up at the controls in the front. You can see how they're mounted. It's all fairly straightforward. Aluminum makes an excellent chassis. It conducts electricity a whole lot better than steel, and for that reason you will cut down on your ground loops. One other thing was kind of amusing is where I got the aluminum. I was going to get some steel. Sometimes, and I hate to suggest this, but old those signs that people put up for when they want to sell their house, well, that steel works okay once you get the paint off. One other thing, though, I found, and a friend of mine had a big sheet of aluminum across his gate to keep his dog in. And apparently one day the dog figured a way to escape anyway, and so he was complaining about that. And I said, well, the least you can do is give me that old sheet of aluminum. And he did, and after I kind of sanded and polished off all the scratching from the dog toenails and all, it turned into several really nice amp chassis. So looking at this, you probably would never believe that not so long ago was hanging on somebody's gate. Okay, so that's the interior of this. I tried to keep it neat. I think it looks pretty snazzy, and I hope you liked it. Let's button this jewel up and see how it sounds. One brief aside here before we continue. Those familiar with the Fender Bassman amp are aware that they have two different channels. They've got a bass instrument channel and a normal channel. Since I had no interest in using this amp for bass guitar, I simply removed that portion from the schematic and then used the first 12AX7 as the input for the guitar, ran it up to the second stage of amplification, the second 12AX7, and then right into the 12AT7 phase inverter and the 6L6s. So if you would like to build this and have no interest in the bass capability, that's the way to do it. Saves you some space and tube sockets and tubes and other things. I will attach a link to this schematic to the description of the video, so if you want to access this schematic, it'd make it easy for you. Okay, now let's get back to the sound check. Okay, here we are plugged into the low gain input. Volume controls at probably around 2.